Hi everyone, welcome whether you're watching us live or catching up later. My name's Vic and I'm on the staff team at St Andrew the Great, which is a church in the city centre of Cambridge. And we're delighted to be hosting this first Monday event in our Real Lives, Real Hope series. Tonight and for the next 4 Mondays, we'll be thinking about some big questions about Christianity, and we'll be joined each week by a special guest who'll be answering those questions. There's more info about all of that stuff on our website, stag.org/hope. The first half of each evening will be an interview, and then the second half will be a chance for you to ask your questions. And if you're watching live, then you can do that even now by posting in the Facebook or YouTube chat, or by going to pigeonhole.at, password is hope. And if you do that, you can vote for other people's questions and ask your questions anonymously. So tonight, our big question is this: where is God in a coronavirus world? And the guest we have who's going to answer that question for us is John Lennox. John is Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at Oxford University, though he also studied in Cambridge for 7 years, which may help some of us to feel more warmly towards him. John, it's great to have you with us. What are your memories of your time in Cambridge?
Oh, I have very happy memories of Cambridge. I was there from 1962 to 1969. And on my first day, I went to church and I met the girl who's been my wife for over 50 years. So that's a fairly vivid memory, to say the least. And also at my time in Cambridge, I went, although I'm a mathematician, I went to listen to the last lectures that C.S. Lewis ever gave in the English faculty. And he's had a huge intellectual influence on my life, and not simply because he's a fellow Irishman.
Wow, so it sounds like Cambridge was a pretty important place for you. Well, John, great to have you with us. John has lectured and spoken internationally on the relationship between science, philosophy and religion. He's written a series of books on science and Christianity, and he's publicly debated some people associated with new atheism, such as Richard Dawkins and Peter Singer. His latest book to be published just provides the title for our event tonight: Where is God in a Coronavirus World? Now, John, you've been a Christian and an academic for many years now. And for some people, they'll find that quite confusing because sometimes academia and the Christian faith seem to be polar opposites. On the one hand, you've got reason and evidence, and the other seems to be all about a blind leap in the dark. How have you managed to square those two things in your life?
By discovering that the second view is completely wrong. That opposition is false. Christianity, as presented in the Bible, in the New Testament, is as rational as science. And the problem arises mainly because of the influence of atheist thinking, particularly under Dawkins and so on, who've got the idea across that faith is a religious word and it means believing with no evidence. And I want to say faith is an ordinary word, and it means believing on the basis of evidence. And therefore, in science, I have to believe things. I'm a mathematician. I believe science can be done. And the rational foundation for that belief is exactly the same as Galileo and Newton and Clerk Maxwell. They believed, as C.S. Lewis said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. So to me, the difference, and there are real differences, is that science involves a rational inquiry and is a set of intellectual disciplines, and theology, Christianity, involves rational belief. And the huge mistake people are making, and they could see it's wrong with a moment's thought, is that science and rationality are coextensive. That is just absurd. History, theology, philosophy, language, literature are all rational disciplines, but they're not the natural sciences. And therefore, I spend a lot of my time trying to get underneath and to show people that this opposition between science, faith in science, if you like, and faith in God is just false. It's a myth.
Well, we're looking forward to hearing more about your thinking about those things tonight and seeing that kind of rationality of faith. Just to say, if you've just joined us, we'd love to hear some of your questions. We'll be putting them to John in the second half of this evening. You can comment in Facebook and YouTube, or you can go to pigeonhole.at, and the password is hope, and you can ask questions anonymously there and vote for other people's. So do go there, post your questions. Well, John, let's speak about your book then. This book that you wrote, Where is God in a Coronavirus World? How did that book come to be?
It came to be partly because I'm a mathematician. And of course, I'm concerned with the big questions, and the question of pain, evil, suffering is one of the hardest questions anyone faces, independent of their worldview. But at the beginning of March, I could see this is going to grow at an exponential rate, and therefore it's going to become really scary. And I thought, here I am in my mid-70s, I'm one of the vulnerable, elderly, I'm going to be locked down. So what can I do that might be useful? And I felt, well, it's an opportunity to at least try to write something from a Christian perspective that shows not that we have a set of simple answers, because we don't, but that we have something to say that might bring hope and understanding to people either who have intellectual questions or who are themselves suffering and have deep emotional reaction to this whole thing. So I sat down and wrote vigorously for a week, sent it to a publisher on a Saturday night, and it was printed by the following Wednesday. And it's now in over 20 languages around the world. So I've been very encouraged to think that for some people at least, it has enabled them to think their way into this complex situation.
That's great. And I guess that idea that you want to say that the Christian message offers hope, that might be quite different from the answer that some people think you're going to give to this question. I guess some people might think, oh, actually, a Christian might say, oh, God, if he exists, has maybe sent this virus as a kind of act of judgment on people. And you hear that kind of chat. Isn't that really what Christians believe?
Well, I arrived in New Zealand in 2011, 2 days after the earthquake, and I met this. I met it in two forms. Firstly, there was a Christianized form. I'll not say it was Christian, you'll see why in a minute, where people say, this is God judging. You've got to face it, this is a direct judgment of God. And then there were others of a more pantheistic viewpoint, Far Eastern religions, who said, look, this is the outworking of karma. People are suffering because they have misbehaved in a previous life. And one consequence of that is a very cruel idea that we shouldn't bother to help them, because if you do, you're simply condemning them to an even worse existence in a future reincarnation. But coming back to the Christian thing, because people feel that, both in the UK and around the world, I get asked this question virtually in every interview. I think it's very important to see what Jesus himself said. That points the compass for me in the right direction. And there's a very important incident described to us in Luke chapter 13, where Jesus is standing on the Temple Mountain in the area where people worshipped. And somebody in the crowd says, this is the place where Pilate came down with his soldiers and massacred a group of worshippers. And Jesus said, yes, and do you think they're any worse than anybody else that was around Jerusalem at the time? I tell you, they were not. But now comes the interesting thing. He went on to describe another incident that took place elsewhere in the city, and he said there was the Tower of Siloam that collapsed, and 18 people were killed. Do you think they were any worse than anybody else? I tell you, they were not. Now, that's not quite the end of what he said, but just think of that. Now, these were what, in comparison with COVID-19, is a minor tragedy, but the principle is exactly the same. These people were watching, and they knew the idea, many of them. In fact, the disciples had raised it once with a blind man. They said to him, Master, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? And Jesus said, neither. So there was that in the background, possibly coming from Greek thinking. We're not sure. But in any case, I believe that the principle that Jesus stated in that day was this: where you see a tragedy, either caused by moral evil, as in the massacre, or what we rather oxymoronically call natural evil, because evil is a moral concept, but those things that we don't immediately attribute to direct human action, like a collapse of a tower, or COVID-19, or an earthquake, where you see that, don't necessarily think that it's because they're worse than anybody else and they're being judged for it. Now, that seems to me to be a very fundamental principle. We need to be very careful before we start interpreting what we observe as judgment. But Jesus hadn't finished. But before I go on to point out what he said, I have observed that those who take the judgmental route, that doesn't turn anybody to God. In fact, what it does, it has the effect of turning people on the speaker and saying, who do you think you are? Arrogating to yourself the knowledge of what God is doing here. And of course, they lose all interest in God. But what Jesus said was this: he turned to the crowd and he said, except you all repent, you shall all likewise perish. Now, that is very important, because he was saying there what is expressed in the central statement, I suppose, of the love of God in the whole of the Bible. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes on him should not perish. Many people have never noticed that the possibility of perishing is stated in that verse that's absolutely full of the love of God. Now, what did Jesus mean? He certainly didn't mean that we've got two ways of dying. Either we're massacred in church or a tower falls on us. But I think what he did mean was this: when you see a tragedy, then how do you react to it? When you see COVID-19, it reminds you of your own vulnerability. It reminds you of your mortality. It makes you think of death. You can't avoid it. And you don't think long about death until you're thinking of eternity and God and all those big questions. And C.S. Lewis said years ago that pain is God's megaphone to wake us up. And I certainly think that although I don't go down this direct judgment route, and there's another reason for that too, I certainly think we need to use effectively this thinking about God. And it's happening in the UK. I'm told that last week, nearly 25% of our population watched part or all of a church service. That's unheard of. And it's what I recall hearing about the last war. People turning to God because of death, because of the uncertainty of life. And we thought we got it all sussed out. There'd never be another pandemic like this. We understood the Black Death killing perhaps 200 million people in Europe, but that'll never come here. And suddenly we've been shattered into reality. My final point, if I may, is this. People say, but didn't God send plagues? And they're recorded in the Bible. I say, yes, he did. But COVID-19, as far as I know, is not mentioned in the Bible. And I don't mean that facetiously. I mean, we don't have a specific word of God on it. And therefore, I think the right thing to do is to see what Jesus said and to follow the implications of it. But you noticed I used the word necessarily, because, of course, life is very complex. We can't see behind a person's experience. And it's clear from the New Testament that some people do suffer because of their sin. We can bring it on ourselves by getting drunk and smashing our car and becoming quadriplegic. And Paul said to the Corinthian church, he said, some of you are sick and some have died prematurely. Why? Because of your disobedient behavior to the word of God. So it's possible, but we must be very careful where we judge it.
Thanks, John. There's a lot to think about there. I'm sure people have got questions about that. Do keep sending them in. I guess some people, having heard that, might still think, well, actually, it's all quite complicated, like this idea of judgment and the relationship between God and human suffering. And actually, isn't it just simpler to say that atheism has a much better, easier solution to this problem of why people who, through no fault of their own, have to kind of suffer the sort of evils that are in the world today? Isn't atheism a better solution than Christianity?
You've used two adjectives there. First, you said, isn't it a simpler solution? The answer to that is yes. And then you said a better solution. The answer to that is no. Let me try and explain that. And I've spent a lot of my life talking to atheists, and I have many atheist friends. But it seems to me that it's at this point that atheism shows that the emperor has no clothes. Because if you take atheism to its logical conclusion, as Dawkins inconsistently does, for example, in saying this universe is just as we'd expect it to be, if at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice, DNA just is and we dance to its music. That's deterministic nihilism. And it removes morality, which is very odd. If there's no good and no evil, why talk about the problem of evil? And Richard Dawkins, I believe, is very inconsistent here because he does call it evil because he's a moral being like the rest of us. And from where I sit, that's because he's made in the image of God. Now, atheism, as you said in your first response, is a simpler answer. It seems to solve the problem. But just a moment, what problem does it solve? It simply tells you this universe, we must accept it as a brute fact, and if it goes badly for you, hard luck. It doesn't solve the suffering. It leaves it there. It makes the problem of meaning infinitely harder because it does remove not only the problem, as they think, it removes all hope, ultimate hope, because atheism is by definition a hopeless faith. It is a faith, of course, a belief system. And it removes all hope. There's no ultimate hope. Christianity retains the problem. I admit it is more complicated, but then Christianity offers something that in one sense is infinitely complicated, but so is electricity. But we know how to use it, even if we don't understand it. And energy, nobody knows what it is, but we can use it. And Christianity comes along, and its fundamental hope is that death is not the end, that Jesus rose from the dead by the power of God. He was raised from the dead. And therefore, those who trust him are offered forgiveness, which is the problem of human sin, which we can talk about as well, because it's part of the original problem and the current problem. But we gain peace with God and a new life that COVID-19 cannot touch. Now, no other philosophy or religion offers that. And so it's very important, if there's any possibility at all that there's any truth in the fact that Jesus has conquered death, I, for one, want to know about it and want to know whether it's solid intellectually and historically and experientially or not.
Okay, so atheism simpler but not better. Let's then come back to something you picked up on, this idea of kind of sin and how that has affected the world according to the Bible. Because I guess some people would say, okay, well, if we accept that there is a God and he's not sending this coronavirus as a direct judgment on the world, well, then we have the other problem, which is why hasn't he stopped it? So if there is a God and he's powerful, why hasn't he made a world which is free of these deadly viruses?
Well, think about it. Now, this is getting more complex, but I don't apologize for that because reality is more complex than fairy tales. And a real car is more complex than a toy car. And most people would prefer a real one. Often people say to me, look, why hasn't, first of all, God made a universe in which there's no moral evil? We'll come to the natural evil in a moment. Why couldn't he have made a universe in which I never go wrong? Well, I say, of course he could. We can make such universes. They're robotic universes. They're amoral. Robots can't sin. And indeed, animals can't sin. We don't haul a lion up on trial if it murders its zookeeper. So there are elements of the world which are not moral in that sense. But I say, why are you wishing yourself out of existence? And the reply often is, pardon? I say you're wishing yourself out of existence because the greatest gift you have from God as being made in his image is that gift that makes you capable of love and developing relationship. Now, that involves, to a certain extent, a certain freedom. God has given us that freedom, the capacity to say yes or no, which is at the heart of all true relationships. She chose me, I don't know why, but she did, and I chose her, that kind of thing. And therefore, if you're going to have a world in which love is possible and deep relationships are possible, then, as Lewis pointed out many years ago, it is inevitable that things may go wrong, and they have gone wrong. You see, I have 3 children. I've got 10 grandchildren, believe it or not. And when the first child was born, a little girl, I held her in my hands in the hospital, and suddenly the awful thought occurred to me, you could grow up to reject me. Why have children? Why make a world, God, in which things go wrong? We know why we have children, because we trust that if we nurture and care for them, the most of us do anyway, that there will be a response of love. But there's always the risk. And in that sense, wording myself carefully, God took a risk. And therefore, the big question that follows immediately is, granted, if that is the case, then has any provision been made that is up to solving the problem? What I mean by that is, this problem started long before me. My parents were good people. They weren't perfect. And the whole sorry human history has gone on for centuries before me. I can't put it right. And God would be cruel if he expected me to put it right. And the wonderful thing about Christianity is that whether we accept it or not, it's good to listen to what it says before we reject it, that this damage started with one person sinning and disobeying God. I'm not going to put it right by my own obedience. And that's where the Christian gospel measures up to the problem. It diagnoses it as infinitely more serious than anything that I have done. But because I'm part of it, it tells me, look, you can't put this right. But I have put it right. So it's not going to be a question of you stretching up to God. It's going to be that I will reach down to you. And the central claim of Christianity is that God became human in Jesus Christ, and he went to a cross. Now, whether we understand it or not, at least we can hear what it says. And what it says is that in some very deep and unfathomable way, Christ paid for the mess that I've made of my own life and other people's lives. And therefore, he tells me, if I trust him, he will give me peace with God right at the start. So Christianity is the exact opposite of a merit-based religion. The gospel is a free gift. In fact, in that sense, Christianity isn't a religion at all, because most religions prescribe a path that you try to keep in the hope that God will one day accept you. The wonder of Christianity, and that's why I'm talking to you tonight, the wonder of it is that I got acceptance years ago. I'm not even appearing on this program in order to gain more brownie points with God. I'm doing it because I have the acceptance, not in order to gain it. So what I'm saying there is there's a balance between the depth of the problem, which is way beyond me, and the nature of the salvation. Now, we haven't said anything, but you haven't asked me about the connection between the moral trespass at the beginning and the physical fracture in the world that we experience down through history.
Well, let me ask you about that now then. What is the connection?
I wasn't trying to make that a leading question, sorry.
No, you carry on, John.
Well, the story is, the account is in Genesis, and I believe it is very profound, is that when the first human disobeyed God, what happened was, and let me give you the New Testament version. Paul said, as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. So all human beings, he means both men and women, of course, they die physically. Why? Because physical death was introduced as a result of that sin. Now, the sin was moral and in that sense spiritual, but it had a physical consequence. And indeed, in the original context, God told the humans, look, the world's going to be different now because of what's happened. You will, yes, you'll be able to do your plowing and your sowing and your reaping, but you're going to find not only wheat and grain, but thorns and thistles. And if I dare say it, you're going to find COVID-19 and pathogenic viruses. So that originally there's a connection between moral trespass and some kind of fracture and damage to the world. And of course, it's not complete. And here's the other mystery. Viruses are essential for life. Very few of them, the medics tell me, and I've asked them, are pathogenic. It's the same with earthquakes. The motion of tectonic plates that brings earthquakes to pass is essential for the supply of oxygen in our atmosphere. So we have a very strange kind of universe where the things that can cause damage are actually things that are vital, which leads to another question, which is surely God could have made fire that warmed but didn't burn, electricity, and so on and so forth. So you're still left with some questions.
Yeah. And I think there will definitely be lots of people out there who want to follow up on these questions. John, why don't we just finish off this little section before we go to people's questions?
Sure.
They can ask further on
Absolutely. Delighted.
So there isn't a direct connection between God is not sending a judgment through COVID-19 directly to people. He is a God who, but there is a connection between moral evil and natural evil. But there is a hope that God offers in the face of that. Could you just say maybe a little bit more about that hope and how God has acted to make right both the moral evil and the natural evil in the world?
Well, the central thing, of course, is the cross of Christ, his death and resurrection. And if we take the Christian claim seriously that Jesus is God incarnate, then it's legitimate to ask, what is God doing on a cross? And I've said to many people in my life, sitting beside them, who've been through awful suffering or experienced Auschwitz and things like that, I've said, look, what does it tell you about God at the very least? It tells you that he hasn't remained distant from human suffering, but has himself become part of it. That's one half of the story. But if that's all there was, we'd never have heard of him. Why we've heard of him is that suddenly 20 centuries ago in Jerusalem, there burst forth this incredible message that Jesus, who had been crucified and was evidently dead, had broken the death barrier and had risen from the dead. And that empowered the early Christians to go around the world and preach this huge message of hope that conquers death. And that is what people deep down are looking for. The atheist has nothing to say to the dying person, but Christians do have something to say. It may not take the pain away. It may not take their death away. There's no guarantee of either of those, but it can fill their hearts with joy and certainty that even if they do die and don't recover, they are moving into life that, if anything, is even more real than this one, in the company of someone who's been through it themselves. And for me, that is a centrally important thing. And it helps intellectually stabilize me, but also emotionally, in the sense that it demonstrates the love of God. Who am I that Christ should die for me? And that's where I am at the moment. And I've lived with this for over 60 years, 65 years probably, ever since my childhood when it became real to me. And I think it's important to be able to say at this stage that it actually works.
Well, I'm sure people have got loads of questions about that particularly. Remember, if you want to ask John a question, you can post it on Facebook or YouTube in the comments section, or go to pigeonhole.at and the password is hope. But John, we've got a question here which follows on from the things you've just been saying. So you say both natural evils like coronavirus and moral evils like violence reflect the freedom that God has given us. If there'll be no death or crying or pain in heaven, does that mean there'll be no freedom?
I see that's an anonymous question.
Yeah.
That interests me greatly because there's no need to keep your name secret from a question like that. It's been asked for centuries. And my approach to it, and I wouldn't die for this, but my approach to it is this, that when I trust Christ, something irreversible happens that I have decided should happen. And that is that I receive eternal life. Now, for the rest of my life, as Paul explains so graphically, I will still battle with what he calls the old nature, or the flesh and so on. But at death, as I understand it, that drops away. And so we enter a world that we have chosen to be in. So because of this, we have restricted our freedom. I restricted my freedom voluntarily when I got married. And that wasn't a negative step, it was a positive step. The difficulty is that often we imagine any restriction of freedom to be negative, but it isn't, you see. If you want to play Beethoven, you have to discipline yourself in order to be able to follow the music. So you restrict your freedom in order for you and others to enjoy this beautiful music. I think something like that has got to be true when you consider this question, that it won't happen again, because, if I might use a geometric illustration, we are not put back through Christian salvation back to where the first humans were. No, it's more like a spiral. We end up above where they were. And so the world to come will have different properties than this world. And we are assured that there's going to be no more pain, no more crying, no more death, no more COVID-19. And that is a glorious thing. And the bit of freedom we give up, if you'd call it freedom, is that we say yes to Christ and we don't say no to him.
That's a great hope to look forward to for those who trust Jesus. We have got a question that's come in from Facebook. So some of the things you said, John, have gone back to that the first humans that the Bible talks about, and how sin entered the world. So I think, question here from someone called Roger. Surely John doesn't believe in the literality of Adam and Eve. Whilst I accept choice is essential, the moral nature of humanity, when in the process of evolution did humanity become capable of making moral choices?
Well, How long have you got?
Not that long.
The number of assumptions here. Surely John doesn't believe. I wonder what lies behind that. You haven't simply said to me, do you believe? Surely I don't believe, so I oughtn't to believe in it. But just a minute. The most influential Christian that there's been apart from Jesus was Paul. And he certainly believed it. In fact, his diagnosis of what is wrong with humanity that I quoted you depended on that. Not only that, but Jesus believed it, you see. And he quoted the creation story. And therefore, surely John doesn't believe it. Would you be prepared to say, surely Jesus didn't believe that? Surely Paul didn't believe it. He did believe it. Now, your reason maybe for not believing it is because at the current state of biological research, the general thinking is that humanity cannot have started with two, but must have had a breeding group. That creates all kinds of problems. Now, I'm not a biologist, but I can assure you that that is by no means settled because I've talked to biologists about it. And the point is, I'm not going to go into this in any more detail. If you want to know, in case you do, I doubt you do, but if you want to, I've written a book called 7 Days That Divide the World about Genesis, and I'm currently revising it in light of the knowledge that's been gained in the 10 years since I wrote it. But you see, because I believe and have many grounds for believing that Jesus is the Son of God, I take very seriously what he says. And therefore, for me, not only did he say that there were these original pair, and he draws the lesson, for this cause will a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. Paul said it very clearly, and he said it as a diagnosis for what's wrong with us. And think of this, if Paul was wrong about that, how can we be sure that he was right when he describes to us salvation? So I would like to respond to you by saying, surely I do believe it.
Great. Okay, I think we're going to go to a question next that's coming from Pigeonhole. Someone's a bit confused about God's role here. So if the virus is not his direct judgment and yet God is all powerful, what is his purpose for COVID?
This is the kind of impossible question to answer. What is God's purpose? I don't know. But all we can do is watch what Jesus says. And when he observed the two tragedies I mentioned in Luke, he said, look, you'll all likewise perish. This is a lesson for everybody unless you repent. So I don't think you need to be confused, at least in this sense, that you can gain from it the fact of asking yourself the question, what is my relationship with God? You see, the title of my book is Where is God in a Coronavirus World? And I'm very tempted, and I have done, say to some people, where was God in your world before the coronavirus? Were you walking with him? Had you got to know him? Or were you not remotely interested in him? Because I want to tell you, he's exactly in the coronavirus world where he was in the world before. That is, he's nearer to you than you think, and he's offering you salvation in Christ. And if coronavirus functions as a wake-up call, then in your case, it will lead to a marvelous result.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's these questions, like you say, are big, and often they don't give us the answers that we want.
No, they don't. And I'll not give you the answers that you want. Let me just say this. This is a Q&A, and you rapidly discover the limitations of my knowledge. But if your question is not simply testing how much I know, you'll soon find out how little that is, but is real. Even if you're not happy, as many of you won't be with my answers, in a sense, that doesn't matter, because if your question is a real question, you won't let it go at this evening. You will make sure that you follow it and do the work and talk to people, Christians, if you're not a Christian, find out. If you don't do that, I'd like to suggest to you that your question may not be so serious as you think.
I think we're going to go to a question which sounds quite serious, quite genuine now. How can you explain to someone who is grieving a deceased relative that God is a God of love in this time?
With great difficulty. Let me put it this way. There's another story in the New Testament that I find very helpful in recent days. It's about Mary, Martha, and Lazarus in John 11. The sisters, their brother Lazarus was ill, Jesus was away, and they wrote a letter and said, Lord, the one you love is sick. They thought Jesus would come, but he didn't come. And they watched their brother die. And it was a tragic scene. And it was very difficult. What was Jesus doing? Was he in quarantine or socially distancing and all that? It raised the big problem. Why wasn't he there? He did eventually come. And when he came to their village, Martha met him first and said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. That shows us that she believed he had the power to keep him from dying. He had real power, but he was absent. He wasn't there. And that's very much the cry of many people today. And Jesus said straight to her, Martha, your brother will rise again. And she said, yes, I know, at the last day. And they entered into a deep theological discussion about the nature of resurrection. But then Mary appeared and she said the identical words, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And then she burst out weeping. Jesus didn't enter into a philosophical discussion with her. He wept too. And I think that reveals to us the heart of God, because it raises deep questions, of course. He'd let the man die. Were these crocodile tears, or were they real? And I think they were real. Here's Jesus seeing and weeping at what death does to a little group. And I believe God is not indifferent. After all, Jesus himself has died. And often the only way we can bring hope to people is being honest with them. If you've had no personal experience of being nearly dead yourself or sitting alongside folks, be very careful, because sometimes even Christians can come across as callous and not understanding. And many people in this situation, they don't want a deep intellectual answer. They want a touch. They want a hug, if only we could give it. And they want to see weeping. And I think some of us Christians might have to be more prepared to weep than sometimes the stiff upper lip society allows us to. Showing friendship, showing concern, all of these things are immensely important. And then as you get the opportunity, point out to them that you're going to die one day too. Not necessarily of COVID-19, but it could be. And what hope do they have? And to try and just begin to work your way into saying, look, death is our common lot. 1 out of 1 people dies. COVID-19 is a case of large numbers at once, but the principle is the same. How do you cope with any death? And showing concern, insight, and above all, listening to people. I was taught when I was a child that I'd got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and I should use them in that proportion.
John, thank you. That's so helpful to think that through, I guess, for each of us. I guess lots of what you said is about Jesus, and lots of it only makes sense if Jesus is who the Bible claims he is. We've got a question here from somebody who says, I've been reading Mark's Gospel with a friend, but struggle to accept and believe the miracles performed by Jesus. Surely they defy the laws of physics and biology, such as healings, walking on water, and the one you just mentioned, the raising of Lazarus.
Another anonymous question. Well, David Hume years ago put up this objection. And the way people formulate it these days, people like Richard Dawkins and Peter Singer and so on, they'll say, look, Hume showed long ago that miracles violate the laws of nature, and therefore they're impossible for an intelligent person to believe. Well, there's some very intelligent people in the world believe in them. Leave me out of this, but the man in charge of the attack on coronavirus in the United States, Dr. Francis Collins, who runs the National Institutes of Health, is a keen Christian believer who does believe in those miracles as I do. Now, of course, we need to be careful. Not all claims to miracle are right, and we need to reserve a skepticism. Skeptic, by the way, means to check out at a distance. But when it comes to it, you see, the problem with Hume is that he was wrong. Miracles do not violate the laws of nature at all. And not long before he died, I got to know the late Anthony Flew, who was the great interpreter of Hume and was indeed the Dawkins atheist of his generation. And in high old age, Hume came to see that Hume was wrong. Sorry, if the philosopher came to see that Hume was wrong, and he told me he'd have to write all his own books. That was Anthony Flew. Sad, really, but very honest. Now, let me try and get this across to you in a couple of sentences. You see, what are the laws of nature? There are descriptions of what normally happens. They are not like the laws of a country. And if I could use an illustration due to C.S. Lewis, suppose I'm staying in a hotel in Cambridge, and the first night I put £100 into the drawer in my bedroom, another 100 the next night. I've got 200 in the drawer. I wake up the next day, open the drawer, there's only £50 in it. What do I conclude? Do I conclude that the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or the laws of England? Now, it's quite obvious that it's the laws of England that have been broken. But how do I know? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. In fact, if I didn't know the laws of arithmetic, I would say, oh, that's interesting. 100 plus 100 were 200 yesterday. Now they appear to be 50. You see, it is a complete false idea that miracles break the laws of nature. Here was the problem, if I might upgrade my analysis of this situation. I thought that the drawer in my room and the cupboard in which it was a closed system. It turned out to be an open system. And many atheists believe the universe is a closed system of cause and effect. But you see, it is not. God, who created it, set the regularities in it that we recognize, and many of them we describe mathematically. If we didn't know the regularities, we'd never recognize a miracle, because a miracle is an apparent exception. But you see, it doesn't violate any laws. When Jesus rose from the dead, it wasn't by any natural process going on in the grave. What the Bible actually says is God raised him from the dead. And the universe being an open system, God, who created it, can, of course, feed a new event into it. And the laws take over. For example, I do believe what Scripture says, that God encoded himself into humanity in a unique way. Jesus Christ was born without a human father. But when Mary got pregnant, the laws of nature took over, and the baby was born exactly 9 months later. That is a law of nature that Luke, the doctor, actually uses as evidence for his divinity, but that's a different story. If you want to follow this a bit more, because it's a hugely important question, because many people just won't consider the idea of a scientist believing in God because of this objection. I've written a book called Gunning for God, and the last 2 chapters of it analyze the resurrection of Jesus from Hume's perspective and deal with it in terms of his ideas on laws. And he was a funny man to speak of laws of nature because he didn't believe in cause and effect, but that's another story. So he had ideas and rules for witnesses and when you should take them seriously. It's very interesting to apply them to resurrection because that's the illustration he himself used.
As John says, there's lots more that you could go and look on his website, johnlennox.org. So if you want to find some more resources there, you can. John, you said quite a lot about the kind of uniqueness of Jesus, I guess, especially in the answer to that last question. I think we've got a question from Facebook about other religions. What do you say to people that say in their following of other religions, they are just as holy as Christians and that every religion, if followed properly, leads to the same place?
Well, what I say to that is it's very rarely people of other religions say that. It's often vague, semi-religious atheists and people who do not know what Christianity is about say that. And you notice in the statement of the question, the word holy is used. That's a moral word. And the first thing I want to say into this debate is before we discuss other religions, let us remember, if we're Christian, that our worldview tells us that every man and woman, whether they believe in God or not, is a moral being made in God's image. Now, you can trace the outworking of that, as C.S. Lewis did in Appendix to The Abolition of Man, written in 1940, well worth reading today. And he pointed out that if you examine every religion, without exception, every philosophy in the world, you'll find a common morality. You'll find, in fact, explicitly, the so-called golden rule. Do unto others as you would they did to you. This is amazing, except that it's not amazing if you believe, as I do, that morality is hardwired into us by the God that created us. So what we've got to do before we enter into an area that is regarded as sensitive, usually by Christians, sadly, but not by my Muslim and Jewish friends and others, is to show that we respect them. Now, I grew up with parents that taught me that human beings are worthy of respect. And if you don't really believe that, then it's better not to enter into this topic. But if you do, and not only believe it, but show it, then we can respect the holiness of people. That is their moral stance. And in fact, it is the case even within the Bible that non-believers put believers to shame by their behavior. Abraham was a case in point, the great forefather of the three great Abrahamic religions. He was put to shame by Pharaoh, who believed in Ra, the god of the sun, and so on. And Abram was utterly ashamed. So let's get that straight. We're not criticizing people's morality, but obvious Abrahamic religions. And when it comes to the central figure of Christianity, Jesus, my Jewish friends believe that he died but did not rise. My Muslim friends believe he did not die. I believe he both died and rose. Those are three mutually exclusive historical situations. How do you deal with that? Well, my Muslim and Jewish friends agree that that's precisely what we all believe. So there's no point in simply pretending it's all moving towards the same place, because it isn't. They won't agree that it is. The only way to answer things like that is, what is the evidence? And that's why all of my life, I have exposed my faith in God to serious questioning, and sometimes pretty violent questioning, from people who don't share it, because I want to be certain. And I've come to the conclusion that Jesus actually is the Son of God, in a sense in which the two other religions deny. So that's the first step. But the second thing is, you mentioned, Vicky, in your question, the uniqueness of Jesus. And some people say that's a very arrogant claim, but just a moment. You see, I mentioned earlier the characteristic of most religions was to prescribe a path or a way, to prescribe teaching that you have to follow, And usually that way does lead to the same place in the abstract sense, that it leads to a judgment, a final assessment, where God decides whether you have lived closely enough to the prescribed path to be accepted into heaven or nirvana or paradise or whatever it is. And that's what religion is. I've asked many people to describe a religion. In fact, it's exactly like the University of Cambridge, isn't it? You get in, you have to do an exam to get in, and then you're on the path, and you've got wonderful professors who are very kind, but they cannot guarantee you a degree. Why? Because getting a degree depends on your merit alone. And because this is deeply ingrained in the human psyche, you only get what you earn. And it's true in life, in business life, commercial life, professional life, all kinds of life. People find it almost impossible to imagine that Christianity is the exact opposite of that. In other words, Christ offers us forgiveness and acceptance at the beginning of the path. Now, that is utterly revolutionary. And he doesn't compete with any other religion, because no other religion offers me that. You see, one of the things, if I might explain this clearly by means of an analogy, I told you at the beginning, I met the girl who became my wife on day 1 or 2 of my time at Cambridge. Suppose I'd come to her at some stage and said, Sally, I'd really like you to marry me. Now, the condition is this. Here's a gift. It's a cookbook. And there are laws in it for how you make apple cake and lamb shank and so on. If you keep these laws pretty well for the next 30 or 40 years, then I will accept you. And you see, Vicky, you're laughing. But why? That is exactly how many people feel religion is. But you wouldn't insult a fellow human being by suggesting that acceptance should be based on performance. Why insult God when he's offering you a salvation on the very same principle? When we got married, she accepted me for some reason, and I accepted her for all kinds of reasons. And the marriage is held because we're not trying to gain acceptance by merit. That's what sets you free to live. And this is utterly revolutionary. And it seems to me that that distinguishes Christianity from religion as such. And as I say it, I mean it. It is not exclusiveness to accept from Jesus what no one else offers. And so I think that that's part of the evidence to me. In fact, it's very important evidence that the Christian faith has answers that deal with the inner reality of what's wrong. And acceptance is utterly basic, and we all know about it in human relationships. And the sad thing is, we don't realize it is the same with God. He's prepared to accept us if we trust him.
So then, John, if we could just do a really quick answer to one part of this last question, that would be great. I think it's a good place to end. So the last question is this. Where exactly is God when I suffer? Is he next to me, or is he watching from afar?
I think he's nearer to you than you think. And I can't really prove that to you, but let me just be very personal. About 10 years ago, I got a pain in my heart, and it was thought to be something angina treatable with medicine. And then too late, they realized I was in serious trouble. I was rushed into hospital in Oxford, and I heard a voice saying, we're losing him. And they ran with me through the corridors, 4 people running towards a theater. We paused at the door and I said goodbye to my wife, because I didn't expect, and they didn't expect, I was going to come out alive. I did come out alive because, amazingly, I didn't have the heart attack, and the doctor said you ought to be dead, but I'll not go into that. All I can say to you is this, that in that situation, I had complete peace. It was, I nearly said uncanny, but it wasn't uncanny. It was everything I believed in, but what I discovered was that God comes near in that way in the situation, not before it, and not theoretically. Let me put it very crudely, he does his stuff when we need it. But that doesn't mean, no matter how much we trust him, that we're going to overcome physical illness and death, because this is only the first stage. There's a new world waiting. And if we could see what lies ahead for believers, I honestly think we'd have far less questions.
John, what a great place to end. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to have you with us. Thanks for answering all of those questions. I'm sorry to everyone who didn't get their questions answered. We've got another event coming up next week. We're going to be interviewing Warren Furman, who used to be in the TV show Gladiators. He's going to be speaking on Is This It? And then other events after that. We hope you can join us for that. If you'd like to get hold of a copy of John's book, that would be a great thing to do. Where is God in a Coronavirus World? Available from all good retailers online. We'd also love it if you could join us for any of our Sunday services. Just head to our website, stag.org, and you'll find out more information there. You might want to ask the Christian friend who invited you. If you didn't get your question answered, you could try them instead, or ask us on our website as well. But John, thank you again very much indeed. And we hope you've enjoyed the evening, and hopefully we'll see you again next week.
Well, thank you very much. I'd just like to say that I have a large website where I have extended lectures on almost all of these issues. It's johnlennox.org. But thank you, Vicky, for doing such a brilliant job at interviewing. I have enjoyed the questions and the questions from the audience, even though I'm sure my answers leave a lot to be desired.
Well, it just means we can go on searching for ourselves, and I hope that everyone will do that. Great. Hope to see you again next week. Enjoy the rest of your evening.